A quick glance at the map of Russian influence in Africa leads to surprising conclusions. Despite being deeply entangled in the war with Ukraine and a proxy war with the West, Russia manages to skillfully expand its influence across the massive African continent, while simultaneously pushing out European and American influence. Moreover, even in Africa, direct clashes between Ukrainians and Russians are occurring. While this description is quite suggestive, it is, as usual in such matters, incomplete. It is true that the Russians' African core brings them tangible benefits. However, its assessment and position in Africa is much more complex. While the recent fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime could set a dangerous precedent for Moscow. How does the Kremlin build its influence in Africa? What is it seeking on the Dark Continent? Let's explore this. Welcome to the 20s Report.
Consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the video to aid the algorithm.
In mid-January, the president of the Central African Republic, Faustin-Archange Touadéra, flew to Moscow. During his conversation with President Putin, he expressed gratitude on behalf of his entire nation for the assistance Russia has provided to his homeland in recent years. Quote, "Your continued support has not only helped restore stability in our country, but has also allowed us to secure a strong position among sovereign states. We will continue to cooperate to strengthen the country's security and borders." Touadéra's statement is more than mere diplomatic courtesy. While speaking on behalf of the entire nation might be an overstatement, Touadéra indeed owes his position and power to the Russian Federation. When the first Wagner Group units appeared in the country in 2018, government forces controlled almost exclusively the republic's capital, Bangui. Over 6 years, with the help of the Russian mercenaries and arms supplies from Russia, they expanded their control to most of the country. While they are still far from suppressing the armed rebellions tearing apart the Central African Republic, there is no doubt that the direct threat to Touadéra's rule has been averted, with Moscow's help. Meanwhile, President Touadéra is just one of many African allies of the Kremlin. Isolated and sanctioned by the West, Russia seeks to build a bloc of friendly states in the global south. Looking for allies in Africa and the Middle East, the Kremlin offers what could be described as survival for resources. Interestingly, this matches Trump's recent approach to Ukraine, which aims to provide aid in exchange for access to Ukrainian raw materials. However, returning to Africa, to leaders facing internal or international challenges, lack of international recognition, sanctions, armed opposition, or civil wars, the Kremlin offers help in maintaining power. In exchange, it profits from natural resource extraction, gold, oil, diamonds, or even timber harvesting, while using the country's territory for its political objectives. This model was first tested in Syria. In September 2015, Russia launched an intervention to help President Bashar al-Assad defeat armed opposition. While this plan didn't fully succeed, mainly due to the involvement of other powers, Turkey and the USA, Russian presence allowed Assad to maintain power for another decade. However, in geopolitics, nothing comes free. In exchange for helping Assad, Russia received shares in oil extraction profits and power projection footholds through military bases in the country. The port facility in Tartus and the airfield in Hmeimim enabled power projection in the Middle East and Mediterranean regions. Syria, of course, is not in Africa, but this example is worth mentioning for two reasons. First, the country served as a logistical base for Russian expansion deeper into Africa. Secondly, the offer directed to African leaders was similar to the one President Assad accepted. In exchange for a percentage of the country's natural resource exports, Russia guarantees a quote, regime survival package, a comprehensive service including political protection, military assistance, and even propaganda and disinformation operations. It is important to remember that Russian expansion in Africa began long before the full-scale war in Ukraine. The notorious Wagner Group first appeared on the continent in 2017. In mid-December of that year, footage emerged showing Wagner personnel training Sudanese armed forces. Russian mercenaries were also meant to support the government in the war with South Sudan and protect gold, uranium, and diamond mines, taking a percentage of extraction profits as payment. We discussed this in our episode dedicated to Sudan. Part of the payment for these services was also an agreement allowing the Russian Navy to use Sudanese ports and potentially build a naval base in the country. This gave Russia access to the Red Sea and further to the Indian Ocean. The presence of Russian vessels in this region would also allow control of the southern exit from the Suez Canal and the Bab al-Mandab Strait, connecting the Red Sea with the Gulf of Aden, key choke points on one of the world's busiest trade routes. In 2018, Wagner operatives appeared in 2 more African countries. In Libya, they provided training on Russian weapons systems to Marshal Khalifa Haftar's soldiers and protected oil fields, with Russia taking a share of the profits. The same model was repeated in the Central African Republic, where mercenaries saved President Tudera's government from collapse. Currently, they provide training for government forces, personal protection for the president, and support in military operations against active guerrilla groups in the region. In exchange, they profit from gold mining and timber exports. The Wagner Group's African adventure didn't end there, with Mali becoming the next country to receive Russian military support. In May 2021, a coup brought General Assimi Goïta to power. However, his position was precarious. Mali faced numerous armed opposition groups, including ISIS and a local Al-Qaeda branch, while the northern Azawad region, inhabited by Tuaregs, had been controlled by separatist groups demanding independence since 2012. In this environment, Russian mercenaries not only train local armed forces, but also participate in military operations against jihadists and Tuaregs. In November 2023, they supported the Malian army in an offensive on Azawad and the capture of Kidal, one of the region's main cities. The payment is, as elsewhere, profits from resource extraction, mainly gold. One might reasonably ask why Russians chose to use a private military company for their expeditionary forces rather than the regular army. There are several reasons. First, Russia often supported leaders or civil war factions not recognized internationally as legitimate authorities. This was the case in Libya, where Russian mercenaries joined Marshal Khalifa Haftar's forces, or in Sudan, where they supported Mohammed Dagalo and his rebel Rapid Support Forces. Wagner Group's unofficial status allowed the Kremlin to deny any connections with the organization. Second, casualties suffered by Wagner personnel didn't burden the Russian government. They weren't Russian soldiers sent to war by the Kremlin, but mercenaries fighting for money. And third, Russia wasn't burdened by any violations of international law or outright breaches committed by the Wagner Group. The Russian operation in Africa was thus proceeding well and bringing expected results, but only for a time. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 slowed the Russian expansion in the Dark Continent, though not completely. When after the first few weeks it became clear that the plan for a quick capture of Kyiv and end to the war had failed, and the assembled forces were insufficient to defeat the Ukrainian army, the Kremlin began frantically reaching for reserves, including its expeditionary units. In March, thousands of Wagner Group mercenaries were transferred from Africa to Donbas, where they spent over a year, until the capture of Bakhmut in May 2023. Only small contingents remained in Mali and the Central African Republic, significantly limiting their activities. Nevertheless, plans to expand the sphere of influence in Africa were not abandoned. On the contrary, It appears the war in Ukraine accelerated this process and led to dropping all pretenses, with mercenaries being replaced by regular Russian military units. Prigozhin's rebellion and march on Moscow in June 2023 starkly demonstrated that while informal and highly autonomous, paramilitary organizations like the Wagner Group are useful tools of international policy, they can easily break free from control. Moreover, since the invasion of Ukraine, confrontation with the West entered a new, more open phase, and competition for influence in Africa could be conducted under one's own banner. It also became pointless to hide casualties in Africa by pretending that unaffiliated mercenaries were dying, rather than Russian soldiers. Compared to the war in Ukraine, these losses are imperceptible to Russian society. Thus, at the end of 2023, the formation of a new expeditionary unit under the Ministry of Defense began, the African Corps. It was to consist of former Wagner Group members and experienced soldiers from elite Russian army units, and replace the organization of the then deceased Prigozhin in its African contracts. Initially, the Corps took over operations in Libya and Syria. The Wagner Group, then controlled by Yevgeny Prigozhin's son, Pavel, was left with Mali and the Central African Republic as its area of responsibility, two countries where it had already established deep roots. Coups in subsequent African states and the withdrawal of Western military missions allowed the Kremlin to expand its presence on the continent. In September 2022, a military coup occurred in Burkina Faso, resulting in Captain Ibrahim Traoré taking power. One of his first decisions was a shift in international policy from pro-Western to pro-Russian positions. In February 2023, at the new president's demand, the French contingent that had previously supported the government in combating terrorist groups left the country. Less than a year later, its place was taken by the Russian African Corps. In January 2024, the first Russian soldiers appeared in Burkina Faso. An almost identical scenario took place in Niger. In June 2023, the country's president, Mohamed Bazoum, was overthrown by his palace guard commander, General Abdulrahman Tiani. The new leader almost immediately demanded the withdrawal of US soldiers from the country, and in April 2024, Russians from the African Corps moved into the former American base in Niamey. In August, local media reported that Russian instructors appeared in Equatorial Guinea, where it was suspected they would oversee the succession of power from the current president to his son. However, brute force in the form of Russian mercenaries is only one side of the coin. The Kremlin offers its African allies more subtle assistance as well. In 2021, the first of the so-called Russian houses opened in Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic. Since then, similar facilities have appeared in many other countries. Russian houses have already opened in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Equatorial Guinea, Chad, Tanzania, Zambia, Sierra Leone, Egypt and South Africa. More are planned in Tunisia, Angola, Algeria, Guinea and Somalia. Officially, Russian houses are meant to promote Russian culture, language and African-Russian friendship. However, cultural and educational activities are only a small fraction of their operations. Their real mission is conducting influence operations. It is no coincidence that the first Russian house is headed by Dmitry Syti, a close associate of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who began his career at the famous Internet Research Agency, or better known as the Trolls from Olgino. According to the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, Russia is the leading propagator of disinformation in Africa, responsible for about 40% of all disinformation campaigns on the continent. In its influence operations, the Kremlin stokes anti-Western sentiments, promotes its role as an anti-colonial power, and advocates for leaders of allied states. Besides bots and trolls spreading pro-Russian narratives on social media, local journalists, influencers, and even entire newsrooms sponsored by the Kremlin are recruited for these campaigns. Initially, influence operations were handled by entities linked to Yevgeny Prigozhin and his business empire. After his death, this network was nationalized and taken over by Rosotrudniczestwo, a state agency under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and by the so-called African Initiative, the propaganda arm of the African Corps. The propaganda network's activity has not diminished at all. Given the scale of Russian involvement in Africa, which is thousands of kilometers from the Russian Federation, a question arises. Why is Russia so heavily engaged in Africa? Why, while entangled in a bloody, prolonged war in Ukraine, does it invest enormous resources in maintaining regimes in such a distant part of the world? The first reason is obvious: resources. Russia itself is a significant resource producer, but generally does not utilize this potential effectively, especially regarding non-energy resources. However, Russia is an effective producer of chaos and military force, particularly in underdeveloped areas. Therefore, it's easier for the Kremlin to gain economic and strategic influence through military force than through other, less aggressive actions. In a recently published report about Wagner Group's activities in the Central African Republic, one Wagner member puts it this way, quote, "There are huge deposits of diamonds and gold here. And how many HIMARS missiles can you get from a kilogram of gold? So we are defending our homeland here too." The game is about who will profit from African resources, Russia or the West. Gold, diamonds, timber, rare earth metals. Africa contains enormous and still unexploited natural resources. And Russia, in a simple though brutal way, wants to gain access to them. However, resources aren't everything. Although Russia undoubtedly gains financially from their exploitation, these aren't resources that could significantly compensate for the costs of war and sanctions. To illustrate, it is estimated that from 2022 to 2023, Russia could have earned $2.5 billion from African gold exploitation. This is an impressive amount until we compare it with Russia's cost of war in Ukraine, which various estimates put at several $100 million daily. Thus, 2 years' profit from gold mining in Africa would cover Moscow's costs for merely a week or two of fighting in Ukraine. Nevertheless, it's important to remember that Africa represents an increasingly noticeable market for Russian goods. Burdened by Western sanctions, Russia seeks new trading partners and finds them in the global south. Last November, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov announced that trade volume between Russia and African countries reached a historic maximum, $24.5 billion. What does Moscow sell? You guessed it, weapons. Russia is the largest arms exporter to Africa. Africa is also one of the world's fastest growing demographic regions. Even more, one of the few regions where natural population growth remains positive. It's home to 1.5 billion people, 1/6 of the world's population. For aging Russian society, Africa represents a labor force resource and even recruits. Increasingly more soldiers from countries as distant as Somalia or Sierra Leone are appearing in Russian army ranks in Ukraine. Besides tangible economic benefits, the continent is also important to the Kremlin for political reasons. Africa is the largest bloc of states in the UN General Assembly, commanding 54 out of 193 votes, 28%. Presence on the continent, especially in Libya, also allows control of migration routes across the Mediterranean, thereby exerting pressure on Europe. It also enables power projection into some of the world's most strategically important regions, trade routes in the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. In other words, economic gains are only a small fraction of potential benefits. Africa, as a continent with weak internal organization, represents an ideal area for expanding influence through Russia's leading export product, military force. Forms of payment will always be found, whether economic, political, strategic, or even counted in human resources. And this ensures that Kremlin won't abandon its chosen course. And so the West lost the first round of competition for Africa. Pro-Western governments fell in many regional countries, replaced by leaders favorable to the Kremlin. French and American contingents were faced to abandon their bases in Niger, Mali, the Central African Republic, and Chad. The governments of Senegal and Ivory Coast also demanded the withdrawal of Western soldiers. Meanwhile, the belt of countries hosting Russian African Corps units stretches almost from the Atlantic Ocean coast, through the southern edges of the Sahara, to the Mediterranean Sea in the north. The network of Russian propaganda facilities increasingly envelops the entire continent. The assistance model, based on combining military support, propaganda disinformation operations, and trade exchanges, seemed to work for a long time, making it attractive to African leaders who, for various reasons, couldn't count on Western help or didn't want it. Indeed, the map of Russian presence in Africa looks impressive. The catch is that, as usual, the propaganda of success begins to falter when we look a bit deeper. Especially recent months' events have severely undermined the Kremlin's credibility as an ally capable of guaranteeing security. The African Corps, which according to ambitious announcements was supposed to field a 40,000-strong contingent capable of operating across the entire continent, has so far been unable to send more than a few hundred people to Africa, while its units in Libya might number as many as 1,800 soldiers. This number was achieved by incorporating previously present Wagner Group members into the Corps. In countries where the African Corps built its presence from scratch, the numbers are much more modest. About 100 Russian soldiers in Niger, 300 in Burkina Faso, and 200 in Equatorial Guinea. Remember, these countries have populations of 27, 23, and 2 million respectively. Reinforcements trained in Russia, intended for Africa, were used to hastily patch holes on the Ukrainian front, first in the Kharkiv region, and after the Ukrainian armed forces' incursion into the Kursk region, also on Russian territory. This clearly shows the Kremlin's allies where its priorities lie, and that it won't hesitate to withdraw from Africa if necessary, to save the situation on its borders. Moreover, in none of the countries where Russian forces are present have they managed to ensure complete victory for their supported side. Libya remains divided between two factions, and the Central African Republic faces numerous rebel groups. In Sudan, the Kremlin backed the wrong horse twice. First, President Omar al-Bashir, who was overthrown in 2019, and after the outbreak of civil war in 2023, the rebel Rapid Support Forces, which are currently on the defensive. As a result, the Kremlin must now work to regain the trust of authorities in Khartoum to allow the construction of a naval port on the Red Sea. In Mali, after the initial success of capturing Kidal, they failed to expand government control over Azawad, and attempts to do so ended in one of the Wagner Group's greatest defeats in its history. Last July, the Wagner Group and Malian army conducted a series of raids on territories controlled by Tuaregs. During the last of these, rebel forces, in alliance with local Al-Qaeda units, completely destroyed the government column in a 3-day battle, or rather a series of ambushes and pursuits near town Zautin. All participants in this expedition were killed, except for 2 Wagner members and several Malian soldiers taken prisoner. More than a dozen vehicles were captured and 2 helicopters were shot down. These losses are not remotely comparable to those the Russian army suffers daily in Ukraine. But this defeat was loaded with consequences for another reason. Footage from the battlefield that later circulated worldwide, showing victorious rebels among dozens of bodies and burned vehicles, undermined the myth of Russian mercenaries as an incredibly efficient fighting machine, capable of tipping the scales of local conflicts in favor of one side. It turned out that desert guerrillas, often dismissively called shepherds by the Russians themselves, could defeat the famous Wagner members, conquerors of the Islamic State, captors of Soledar and Bakhmut, the unit with the highest combat readiness in the world, as they like to call themselves. Therefore, as both the quality and the quantity of Russian presence in Africa is being questioned, African warlords seeking help in Moscow are experiencing more sleepless nights, wondering whether the help, for which they spent millions of dollars, is truly a guarantee of maintaining their position at the top. Moreover, the defeated Tawzautin is minor compared to December's events in Syria. After a lightning offensive by rebels, President Assad's regime collapsed like a house of cards, and the presence of Russian army, air force and fleet in the country, resources far exceeding those stationed in Africa, did nothing to help. After initial failed attempts to stop the offensive, Russia simply abandoned its longtime ally, withdrew its forces from Syria, and even began negotiations with the new authorities in Damascus. Thus, the trust of African allies in Russia has undoubtedly been severely shaken. It turns out that the survival for resources arrangement only works as long as things go smoothly. President Assad's fate serves as a stark memento. In the face of major problems, the security guarantees supposedly provided by the presence of Russian troops on the country's territory mean absolutely nothing. Some African leaders hosting Russian military forces are beginning to look for new patrons and are turning toward Turkey or China. The fall of Assad's regime, however, represents more than just reputational losses. It also creates problems for Russian forces in Africa. Until now, Syria served as a logistical hub, supplying African contingents. Military transport aircraft cannot fly directly from Russia to sub-Saharan African countries. To this date, supplies were delivered with stopovers in Syria. After the HDS took power, the airbase at Khmeimim used for this purpose remained in Russian hands, but has almost completely ceased operations, pending possible arrangements with the new government, and most of the equipment has been evacuated. This has severely hampered the supply of African contingents. While Russia is trying to compensate for this loss with similar bases in Libya, the country cannot fulfill the same role as Syria. It is much farther from Russia and lacks appropriate infrastructure. Moreover, Libya remains mired in crisis and divided between competing factions, and Marshal Haftar could at any moment meet a fate similar to President Assad's. The struggle for Africa between the West and Russia continues. Neither France nor the United States intend to easily cede ground on the continent, and they have to move their bases to pro-Western bloc countries centered around Nigeria. Even Ukraine, facing an exhausting conflict on its own territory, understands Africa's importance and sends its special forces wherever it can thwart Russian expansion plans. Ukrainian soldiers from military intelligence units haunted Wagner members in Sudan, provided assistance to Tuaregs from Azawad, and according to some sources, also trained Syrian rebels who overthrew President Assad. The rivalry is thus intensifying, and the progressing destabilization of the region, such as the escalating conflict between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, means it could spread to increasingly larger areas of the continent. Not only Africa's future, but also the outcome of Russia's confrontation with the West may depend on its result.